Nós vamos abrir para perguntas, como de praxe, recolher 3, 4 perguntas e voltar à mesa. Eu vou pedir uma licença de 5 minutos, vou pedir para o Bernardo assumir as minhas funções aqui, para repetir uma frase que eu ouvi uma certa vez, só poderia ser de um britânico. Ele ia pedir desculpas porque ele tinha que se retirar para ir ao toalete. Ele disse, I feel an urgent call from nature. Então, eu tô na mesma situação, você assume por...
May I wish you good luck?
Assume por 3 minutos aqui.
Sim.
Perguntas concisas.
Concisas.
Recolhe 3 ou 4 e volta.
First of all, congratulations for you both for the explanation. My name is Marcos Peçanha, and I would like to know, when I see your graphics, I'm suspicious that the investments from Chinese corporations have a lot more geopolitical components than just looking for P&L. So you mentioned Brazil, but Cuba has more investments than Peru, I guess, it's hard to understand it in terms of only looking for P&L. So just yesterday, Walmart sold 80% of its corporation here in Brazil to a fund based in Washington. How is it going to be? Are we running risks when the returns do not show? That's what I would like to know.
I just wanted to make a few points. We have different levels of discussion here. There are two, in fact, it's a long discussion. But I just wanted to point out one, is that when you look at the US perspective or what's going on in China and Brazil and other countries in the third world, I think there's a big difference of optic is the fact that US is a big competitor in commodities in all these countries. And I think that changes the view of the US and of Brazil. Whereas China is a big demander of commodity, very huge, much more even than Europe, I would say, because Europe has this agriculture issue. So I think that changes a little bit the nature of all this discussion. And the other point I wanted to make is that we had, not an elephant, but we had a Japanese initiative which is very similar, except for the energy sector, in the 70s here in Brazil. And it's there, it's here, it has lost its momentum. I don't think the Chinese will lose its momentum, but I think that it is not such a big elephant for a while in Brazil. In Africa it is. You go to Africa, you say it's a big elephant. You see Chinese everywhere. But in Brazil, it is less of an elephant. If you look at Canadian investments in Brazil, maybe they are similar in the charts that you've presented. In power, and in oil, in real estate, and Canada is not even mentioned here. So I just wanted to ask how you comment these issues.
Mais uma pergunta e a gente... Senão a gente pega essas duas perguntas e avança. Sim, desculpe, não tinha visto.
A minha pergunta em português para o Bernardo. Você falou... Meu nome é Alex Strum. Eu gostaria de saber... Você mencionou que essa mudança cultural, política profunda que está ocorrendo. Eu gostaria de saber se você poderia citar 2 ou 3 valores fundamentais nossos, ocidentais, que você vê correndo risco por essa influência chinesa.
Boa pergunta. Evan, would you like to answer first?
Thank you very much for those wonderful questions. First of all, with respect to the geopolitical dimension, I go back to my statement of Chinese strategic objectives. I believe that the primary objectives are economic, but as you pointed out, there are certainly other objectives, and the strategic objectives such as obtaining access to commodities, etc. So I'm going to focus on what I think are the lesser objectives. I don't mean to imply that these, for me, are the primary or secret Chinese objectives, but I believe there are non-economic objectives. So, for example, the fact that the amount of Chinese investment in the small and dispersed markets of the Caribbean goes far beyond what you can justify as a market. And I think just as the Chinese are very sensitive to U.S. political and economic presence in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, there's a recognition that it's the strategic interest for China to have political and other influence. So if you look at one of the largest container ports, Hutchison Whampoa, which is there again in the Bahamas, just 90 miles off of the U.S. coast. If you look at Bahamar, the $4.2 billion facility, if you look at the quantity investment that's gone into Jamaica, the North-South Highway, the East-West Highway, I think there are maybe 5 Confucius Institutes just in the Caribbean. The influence in Barbados with the Barbados Hilton and other things. Now in Trinidad, it is enormous. And Venezuela is probably a key. What I believe is that China recognizes that the value of Venezuela is not just the 300 billion barrels of oil, but it's also having a relatively anti-U.S. or at least a non-compliant ally in terms of its orientation toward Washington just across the Caribbean. And so I think the Chinese would like to have a more efficient regime in Caracas. I think I've talked to people from Chinese companies. I have, I think legitimately Chinese friends who express what a nightmare it is to do business. And in addition to that, many Chinese shop owners who have come to Caracas and other parts have actually fled Venezuela because they find themselves targets in the tremendous criminal situation. But I think the Chinese are not going to push for a pro-U.S. democratic Venezuela just to get the efficiency. I think that the Chinese are being very cautious about putting new loans in, but they, as well as the Russians with Rosneft, would like to steer a transition without losing that character of the Venezuelan regime. And so I think it's a difficult balance, but certainly there are these strategic dimensions, I think, for the Chinese. Again, to me, it's the Chinese are trying to shape a world that is not of their own making, still in the context of a high level of interdependence commercially and financially on the U.S., on treasury bonds, on U.S. technology, on U.S. markets. It's a very delicate dance. With respect to the many good points that you made, the issue of complementarity versus competitiveness, and ironically in Brazil, of course, Brazil very large and complex, you have a little bit of both. On the one hand, you have primary product sectors. For me, for example, the complicated position of Vale, which on the one hand saw Minmetals and other Chinese companies as enormous purchasers of its goods, and yet also my impression is that Vale has been very worried about whether EC Minerals, Honbridge Holdings, and others would have a presence and logistics access to the sea in Brazil that could actually damage their near monopoly position. So I think even in those sectors, or in the soy industry, again, you have the Bungees and Dreyfus and Cargills. I think seeing China as a purchaser, but also very worried that projects like Chongqing Grain or Sanhe Hopeful could do an end run around their logistics dominance. So I think it's a struggle. In other industries, of course, the manufacturing, again, that sense of the Chinese as a competitor. So, but I recognize also what you say, that in many ways there's also a competitiveness with the United States in markets such as soy, where and ironically, some of the U.S. trade war actions could easily benefit Brazil by making the Chinese turn to expanded purchases of Brazilian soy. So it's a very complex interrelationship. Also, it's interesting the position of the Japanese trading companies and the Korean chaebol. My sense is that since the 1970s, the Japanese have done a very good job in learning to be Brazilian local players and investing locally and working out the relationship with the Brazilian state. And I think with time, the Chinese are moving in that direction as well. But I think part of that is that the Japanese have now become, in many ways, domestic stakeholders. And of course, here in Sao Paulo, also the importance of the Japanese community. I think it's the largest Japanese community outside of Japan. But these are complex and change with time. And then finally, the question about values. I think, and again, I don't want to make things absolute because, again, I have many Chinese friends and I have much respect for the legitimate aspirations of China and Chinese development. But I think the system is different. China's system with the Taoisean and Confucian roots and thinking about morality oriented around relationships. And, so if you look at how the Chinese behave where they are strong in the South China Sea and the East China Sea versus how they behave where they perceive themselves to still be weak, closer to the United States, and how that changes. The willingness to go along with international law of the sea versus ignore it when it goes against their interests in places close to China. Or the idea of freedom of expression or personal privacy rights. What the Chinese are doing with social capital, for example, and some of their big data and surveillance complexes, for me, is absolutely terrorizing. And I worry about countries such as Venezuela learning to apply those types of technologically based things, as well as, again, some of the more direct impediments to freedom of expression that I mentioned. But I think in general also it's the question of the style of advancing one's developmental objectives. The Chinese have been very successful in these days in being relatively unified, and in part it comes from the unity of the Han people and the sense of a common civilizational goal. We in the West, I think probably the United States as much as Brazil are maybe a little bit more messy. We fight each other, we doubt each other, and there was an interesting article I saw the other day which was, is China's success causing the West to doubt itself? Is the West coming to the conclusion that, we've done a lot, I think, in the United States and other places to limit our effectiveness and shoot ourselves in the foot through our disagreements, whereas it seems that the Chinese, with their emphasis on unity, are advancing. And at the end of the day, the question becomes, is progress without public disagreement better than problems, but problems which preserve individual liberty and freedom of thought? And I think that's actually part of the civilizational debate of the 21st century, whose answer is still very much open, just like the question between, racist nationalism and fascism and other things in the debates of the 20th century were, at the outset of the 20th century, open debates. And so I think those are some of the larger philosophical issues, but thank you.
Como eu fui cortado, o Filipe está certo. Cada vez que muda hegemon, ou muda pelo menos o centro de poder, na América Latina, né, um tema que é interessante, a saída da Inglaterra entre os Estados Unidos significou para a Argentina a queda, né? Ou seja, depende, me fala o que o hegemon produz, vende, compra, e vou te dizer o que vai acontecer com a gente, simplificando muito. É mais complexo, como mostra, inclusive, o livro Fernando Henrique, uma certa autonomia das elites políticas, da capacidade de jogar, né, com os poderes centrais. Mas, certamente, nós temos mais complementaridades, até certo ponto, com a China, por exemplo, do que tivemos, mas é uma simplificação extrema, porque os países estão mudando e hoje temos transformações tecnológicas enormes que colocam novos desafios, né? Mas a segunda elemento é, concordo também contigo sobre que o Brasil não é África, né? Na África está acontecendo coisa que não está acontecendo no Brasil, né? E não sei se vai algum dia acontecer. Por isso que minha preocupação não é somente a influência, não é somente a influência chinesa, é o que está acontecendo no Ocidente. Ou seja, essa crise da globalização, né? Os chamados novos populismos na Europa e nos Estados Unidos. A dificuldade nossa, né? Eu acredito que a América Latina é parte, no sentido lato, do Ocidente. E aí eu me permitiria dizer, sem entrar numa discussão, inclusive mistificadora, porque nosso Ocidente é o Deus Janus, né? Tem uma fase liberal, democrática, direitos humanos, uma fase cruel, né? A história do Ocidente também foi muito cruel, desde o colonialismo, o imperialismo, e o interesse nacional sempre veio junto com o discurso de direitos humanos que se aplica dependendo dos interesses nacionais, né? Então, sempre teve essa ambiguidade. Mas, ainda assim, acredito que parte de uma tradição cultural central no Ocidente, o que a gente chamaria as liberdades, né? A ideia de uma democracia representativa, e na ordem internacional criada após 45, há dois princípios, aliás, que até certa forma antinômicos, que é a soberania nacional e o respeito aos direitos humanos, né? E na própria América Latina, já há algumas décadas, com o Mercosul, na verdade, saímos da tradição soberanista e entramos na tradição de valores comuns, ou seja, o princípio democrático que orienta o Mercosul e, teoricamente, todas as instituições latino-americanas nas últimas 2 décadas, diz sim soberania nacional, mas estamos falando de valores democráticos comuns que, inclusive, justificam expulsar alguém, né, das associações se não mantém esses valores. Obviamente que a China, como foi dito aqui, é uma tradição diferente. E não se trata de criar monstros, como já foi criado monstros em outras épocas, né? E Estados Unidos é particularmente especialista, sempre precisa de inimigos, né? Como, pelo menos nos últimos 80 anos, para existir como sociedade, né? Vai produzindo inimigos constantemente. Não se trata de criar um inimigo, mas já eu diria de tentar exercer algum tipo de diálogo dentro do possível, porque a sociedade chinesa é uma sociedade fechada, centralizada, autoritária para nossos valores. Como diz um amigo meu chinês, né, que é conhecido também do Sérgio, assessor do governo chinês, olha, nós aceitamos o Ocidente até o Renascimento. Tudo que representa de humanidade, ciência, não nos identificamos totalmente. O liberalismo individualista não é parte de nossa cultura, né? Não significa que eles vão conseguir, inclusive, parar por quanto tempo vai ter esses avanços, ainda que nossa sociologia da modernização estava errada, era mecanicista, achava crescimento econômico traz classe média, que traz valores individualistas, democracia. Essas equações estão erradas, né? A sociologia não é boa quando produz equações porque dá errado, né? Porque os desenvolvimentos históricos são muito mais dispersos, né? Mas não significa que eles não terão seus problemas também. Mas o que inclusive, eu volto a insistir, eu acho que o problema central nosso termos não é a China enquanto China, somos nós enquanto nós, nossas próprias tradições autoritárias que estão presentes na nossa sociedade, que poderão se utilizar da China, mesmo a China não querendo, né, para recuperar um certo tipo de discurso que está dentro de nossas sociedades. É isso que me preocupa, por isso que eu tentei recolocar o debate não somente em termos da China, mas aonde que está hoje posicionado o Ocidente e essa crise, que eu volto a insistir, não acredito que seja temporária, de curto prazo, que depende de um presidente mudar.
Muito bem. Acho que estamos chegando ao final. Margarida. Felipe queria fazer um comentário. Então, um comentário. Faz no microfone e depois, Margarida.
It's a side issue, but I think it's important as well. Is that the way that China interacts, engages with the U.S., Europe, on one side, its domestic market on the other, and these commodity supplying countries is different. It's very different. And the fact that China has finished its building its infrastructure, has an unused capacity, enormous unused capacity in steel, in electrical power equipment, and a huge problem with the banks that hold these loans of these companies, has pushed China to use this unused capacity, even using the RMB so it can recycle that with their local currency. So the additional cost to supplying to Africa, to us, is juntando a fome com a vontade de comer, which doesn't happen in other. So this is a particular moment of China's situation that fits as well. So in order not to, in order to build a huge China menacing or whatever, it's
a constellation.
Exactly.
Margarida. E mais
Hello, I'm the Consul of Mexico in Sao Paulo, and I enjoyed very much the presentation. I would just like to ask, in a context of the failure of renegotiating NAFTA, we're seeing a new scenery in terms of trade that impacts the whole continent. How will China react to this new scenario we have?
Mais última pergunta ali à minha esquerda.
Ercídia Coelho, Unesp, Universidade Estadual Paulista. O que sabemos da China é que sempre ela se fechou, tem uma história muito antiga, muito isolada, né, até o século XIX. E o Ocidente sempre tentando, a partir do Renascimento, e principalmente do XIX, tentando criar valores e expandir esses valores. Do que eu ouvi até agora, e pude compreender, há uma expansão econômica da China. A China não me parece querer expandir a sua cultura, sua maneira de pensar e dar ao mundo uma nova... impor a sua cultura, impor a sua história. Que saída o Ocidente tem na medida em que o próprio Ocidente é o seu próprio crítico?
Muito bom. Evan. You go first, or the other way around. You go first and you close. Right, okay. Yeah.
Muito rapidamente, eu concordo primeiro com Felipe que temos que nos cuidar de criar monstros, né? O que não significa que não estamos vivendo em um momento de transformação que, volto a insistir, não é só a China. Há mudanças por todos os lados. E essa percepção que nós, como latino-americanos, temos que ter, não nos fixar só em uma coisa e ver o que podemos fazer. Né? Em relação ao tema, que é muito amplo, veja bem, dizer que o impacto da China é econômico, obviamente que não. Na medida que um país cresce, que passa a ter uma capacidade de projeção de poder, projeta seu poder em termos de seus interesses. Hoje tem cada vez mais países africanos que votam com a China porque eles estão sob, né, o guarda-chuva econômico chinês e tem um custo político. A ordem mundial não funciona separado economia, política, cultura. As dinâmicas são diferentes, cada um projeta em forma diferente. E os chineses, nesse sentido, inclusive explicitamente afirmam que essa ordem internacional aí não é exatamente o que eles desejam, porque não foi o que eles criaram, gostariam de mudar, não é pela força, né, mas gostariam de impactar, então estão impactando cada vez mais nas relações internacionais. Eles são brilhantes, usam a Rússia o tempo todo, no momento, né, eles colocam a Rússia para pôr a cara e eles concordam, mas não aparecem quase, mas estão lá, né? Então, há esse impacto. Como vai se dar, de que forma, certamente é diferente do estilo ocidental tradicional, inclusive como falou Evans, porque a forma tradicional, vamos dizer assim, de dominação, de hegemonia da China, historicamente, não é a mesma que do Ocidente, né? A tradição ocidental, né? Através de hierarquias, de formas diferentes de submissão e reconhecimento, que significa que se algum dia houver, que não é o caso, que acho que necessariamente vai acontecer, uma real dominação chinesa no mundo, vai ser similar à que houve anteriormente. Mas há, obviamente, uma projeção de poder em todos os níveis. Evan?
And first of all, I want to say that I very much appreciate Bernardo's comments as well as Sergio and all of these comments. For me, I have the privilege of having known Bernardo for a number of years before this, and so I really appreciate it, and I value the opportunity to have this type of dialogue, because I think in many ways, oftentimes we in Washington have the bad habit of declaring and preaching, and one of the things I've always really valued about my Brazilian friends is they have a good, critical, sometimes a little contentious discourse. Many good questions. I actually wanted to respond to a few comments from Bernardo also. One was about Brazil versus Africa. And it was interesting because I really started following China, Latin America very closely in about 2003, 2004. And if you remember, it was when President Hu Jintao came to the APEC summit in Santiago announcing $100 billion in new investment that the region kind of woke up. But at the time, I think about $20 billion of that investment was supposed to be in Brazil. And I think the interesting assumption when President Hu put together his agenda was he asked all the companies and ministries, well, what are all the things we could do? And the expectation was that this would work just like it worked in Africa. This country has a mine. They need this. Brazil needs infrastructure. They have mining. Well, we'll build infrastructure that goes to the mine. And as one of my Chilean friends said when I asked about why it didn't work in Chile, he said, well, my dear Evan, it's because we Chileans have laws. And what I was seeing in Brazil, that first phase of Chinese expansion, almost none of the projects occurred in Brazil, nor in Argentina, nor in Chile, as the Chinese and President Hu expected. Because the Africa model of government-to-government relations, which go around traditional procurement policies, Brazil had at the time Bandesh, it had Odebrecht, it had although imperfect, a well-developed public procurement system that pushed back. To me, it's interesting that, and of course, then it shifted to other places where there was more flexibility with the governments, both ideologically and personally. Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, the smaller Caribbean nations. But what worries me is that at this moment of Brazil's self-doubt and weakness as it struggles to purge the corruption from its institutions and government, that I think in that moment of economic need, some of the types of things that were not possible before are possible now. And it's a combination of China's increasing sophistication and of its companies, but also of Brazil's needs. Brazil is not Africa, but I think Brazil is at a vulnerable moment. And Brazil needs to evaluate those advances in the context of that vulnerability. I also can't resist but to comment on the new populism. For me, as an American, as a North American, it worries me as well. One of your magazines, I think it's Brazil Magazine, has an expression for how many years Brazil trying to understand itself. And maybe for us in the United States, at times we have a similar problem. I think it's a problem that we in the United States don't fully understand. And we in the United States do not always do a good job at communicating our values in complexity. But for me, as someone who grew up in the United States, I I think the values of, there's a good-heartedness that I see that I think has not been lost despite the impulses of populism, and I think it's those things that at the end of the day will be fundamental to establishing this relationship. With respect to Mexico, and your very good question, and I write a lot on Mexico and that very important relationship, both a security relationship and economic relationship, is very close to my heart, and I worry about where that might be going. I think in general, certainly President Xi and China are taking advantage of China's new role as a champion of free trade, but defining free trade in different ways. I think Mexico specifically Mexico is 2 or 3 days from the U.S. market with much infrastructure. Mexico, during many sexennios, has tried to expand its relationship with China, but the combination of Carlos Slim and the Mexican industrial groups, who, just like here in Brazil, see certain threats to the interest of allowing the Chinese in, that has continued to make the relationship complicated. There's only so much pork and tequila that Mexico can export to China, and when it involves things that threaten the Mexican industrial groups like Dragon Mart, for example, the Mexicans are very good at pushing back. But I think clearly in areas like free trade, and certainly in the discourse, I think it'll be interesting to see whether a President AMLO continues to take advantage of Mexico's role in the Pacific Alliance, which I think is one very creative way that Mexico can both take advantage of the promises of the Pacific while exerting Mexico's traditional leadership role. And at the end of the day, I think reflecting on what China brings, I think one of the questions is this notion of not can everyone benefit, but who benefits more and how. I think the relationship with China is like any other relationship for Brazil and many other countries. If one is not internally healthy, one gets taken advantage of. One cannot take it. China offers a lot, but I think it's important for Brazil and many other countries to be institutionally healthy, so that it can negotiate from a position of strength and take advantage of what China offers. One of the best deals that a Latin American country got from the Chinese, it's an old case. It was when Sinopec, it was the gasoline pipeline. And initially, China Exim Bank wanted to do it with 70% Chinese labor, and I think funding from China Exim Bank. And your government said, no, we have our own development bank that we call Bandesh, and we always do it with 70% Brazilian labor. And there was a bit of a joke. But in the end, very different than the outcomes that Venezuela has negotiated, very different than the outcomes that Jamaica has negotiated. They switched banks to China Development Bank, and at the end of the day, I think it was done roughly 50-50. And for me, the point is that there is a lot that China and Brazil can do together that can benefit both, but it requires strong institutions and it requires a healthy discourse to be able to achieve that. And frankly, I think that's also part of the key of the future U.S. relationship. The United States cannot keep China or any other actor out of the Western Hemisphere. But I think what China's entrance does is it challenges us to be better partners. It challenges us to be partners to help work in helping the region, strengthening institutions and sharing knowledge, not to keep China out, not the Monroe Doctrine, but this is a region where what happens here affects all of us. We are bound, the U.S., to the region by ties of geography, by ties of immigration. Immigration is so important that it helped elect our current president. We are tied by bonds of family, and so what happens in the Americas affects the United States. And so we have a vested interest in helping to work to strengthen those institutions so that the region, not to keep China out, but so that the region can be healthier and more prosperous for its interaction with China. So in a way that, you know, it's not just win-win, but frankly, it's win-win-win for the United States and the region, who are intimately bound by these ties. So again, thank you for the honor of being able to share my work here today, and the opportunity to be here.